Everyone has secrets, especially me. Lady Whistledown's Society Papers, April 14th, 1824. I wish I'd known you kept a journal, Penelope said, reapplying pressure to his palm. Why? I'm not sure, she said with a shrug. It's always interesting to find out there is more to someone than meets the eye, don't you think? Colin didn't say anything for several moments, and then, quite suddenly, he blurted out, You really liked it? She looked amused. He was horrified. Here he was, considered one of the most popular and sophisticated men of the ton, and he'd been reduced to a bashful schoolboy, hanging on Penelope Featherington's every word, just for a single scrap of praise. Penelope Featherington, for God's sake. Not that there was anything wrong with Penelope, of course. He hastened to remind himself, just that she was, well, Penelope. Of course I liked it, she said with a soft smile. I just finished telling you so. What was the first thing that struck you about it? He asked, deciding that he might as well act like a complete fool, since he was already more than halfway there. She smiled wickedly. Actually, the first thing that struck me was that your penmanship was quite a bit neater than I would have guessed. He frowned. What does that mean? I have difficulty seeing you bent over a desk, practicing your flicks, she replied, her lips tightening at the corners to suppress a smile. If ever there were a time for righteous indignation, this was clearly it. I'll have you know I spent many an hour in the nursery schoolroom, bent over a desk, as you so delicately put it. I'm sure, she murmured. Hmm. She looked down, clearly trying not to smile. I'm quite good with my flicks, he added. It was just a game now, but somehow it was rather fun to play the part of the petulant schoolboy. Obviously, she replied. I especially liked them on the H's. Very well done. Quite flicky of you, indeed. She matched his straight face perfectly, indeed. His gaze slid from hers, and for a moment he felt quite unaccountably shy. I'm glad you liked the journal, he said. It was lovely, she said in a soft, faraway kind of voice. Very lovely, and she looked away, blushing. You're going to think I'm silly. Never, he promised. Well, I think one of the reasons I enjoyed it so much is that I could somehow feel that you'd enjoyed writing it. Colin was silent for a long moment. It hadn't ever occurred to him that he enjoyed his writing. It was just something he did. He did it because he couldn't imagine not doing it. How could he travel to foreign lands and not keep a record of what he saw, what he experienced, and perhaps most importantly, what he felt? But when he thought back, he realized that he felt a strange rush of satisfaction whenever he wrote a phrase that was exactly right, a sentence that was particularly true. He distinctly remembered the moment he had written the passage Penelope had read. He'd been sitting on the beach at dusk, the sun still warm on his skin, the sand somehow rough and smooth at the same time under his bare feet. It had been a heavenly moment, full of that warm, lazy feeling one can truly only experience in the dead of summer, or on the perfect beaches of the Mediterranean, and he'd been trying to think of the exact right way to describe the water. He had sat there for ages, surely a full half an hour, his pen poised above the paper of his journal, waiting for inspiration. And then suddenly he'd realized the temperature was precisely that, of slightly old bath water, and his face had broken into a wide, delighted smile. Yes, he enjoyed writing. Funny how he'd never realized it before. It's good to have something in your life, Penelope said quietly. Something satisfying that would fill that will fill the hours with a sense of purpose. She crossed her hands in her lap and looked down, seemingly engrossed by her knuckles. I've never understood the supposed joys of a lazy life. Colin wanted to touch his fingers to her chin, to see her eyes when he asked her, "And what do you do to fill your hours with a sense of purpose?" But he didn't. It would be far too forward, and it would mean admitting to himself just how interested he was in her answer. So he asked a question, and he kept his own hand still. "Nothing really," she replied, still examining her fingernails. Then, after a pause, she looked up quite suddenly, her chin rising so quickly it almost made him dizzy. "I like to read," she said. "I read quite a bit, actually, and I do a bit of embroidery now and then, but I'm not very good at it. I wish there were more, but well." "What?" Colin prodded. Penelope shook her head. "It's nothing. You should be grateful for your travels. I'm quite envious of you." There was a long silence, not awkward, but strange nonetheless, and finally Colin said, brusquely, "It's not enough." The tone of his voice seemed so out of place in the conversation that Penelope could do nothing but stare. "What do you mean?" she finally asked. He shrugged carelessly. "A man can't travel forever. To do so would take all the fun out of it." She laughed, then looked at him and realized he was serious. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to be rude." "You weren't rude," he said, taking a swig of his lemonade. It sloshed on the table when he set the glass down. Clearly he was unused to using his left hand. "Two of the best parts of travel," he explained, wiping his mouth with one of the clean napkins, "are the leaving and the coming home. And besides, I'd miss my family too much were I to go off indefinitely." Penelope had no reply, at least nothing that wouldn't sound like platitudes, so she just waited for him to continue. For a moment he didn't say anything. Then he scoffed and shut his journal with a resounding thud. "These don't count. They're just for me." "They don't have to be," she said softly. If he heard her, he made no indication. "It's all very well and good to keep a journal while you're traveling," he continued, "but once I'm home, I still have nothing to do." "I find that difficult to believe." He didn't say anything, just reached for a piece of cheese off the tray. She watched him while he ate, and then, after he'd washed it down with more lemonade, his entire demeanor changed. He seemed more alert, more on the edge, as he asked, "Have you read Whistledown lately?" Penelope blinked at the sudden change of subject. "Yes, of course. Why?" "Doesn't everyone read it?" He waved off her question. "Have you noticed how she describes me? Um, it's almost always favorable, isn't it?" His hand began to wave again, rather dismissively, in her opinion. "Yes, yes. That's not the point." he said in a distracted voice. You might think it more the point, Penelope replied testily, if you'd ever been likened to an overripe citrus fruit. He winced, and he opened and closed his mouth twice before finally saying, if it makes you feel better, I didn't remember that she'd called you that until just now. He stopped, thought for a moment, then added, in fact, I still don't remember it. It's all right, she said, putting on her best I'm a good sport face. I assure you I'm quite beyond it, and I've always had a fondness for oranges and lemons. He started to say something again, then stopped, then looked at her rather directly and said, I hope what I'm about to say isn't abominably insensitive or insulting, given that when all is said and done, I have very little to complain about. The implication being, Penelope realized that perhaps she did. But I am telling you, he continued, his eyes clear and earnest, because I think maybe you'll understand. It was a compliment, a strange, uncommon one, but a compliment nonetheless. Penelope wanted nothing more than to lay her hand across his, but of course she could not. So she nodded and said, You can tell me anything, Colin. My brothers, he began. They're... He stopped, staring rather blankly toward the window before finally turning back to her and saying, They're very accomplished. Anthony is the Viscount, and God knows I wouldn't want that responsibility, but he has a purpose. Our entire heritage is in his hands. More than that, I should think, Penelope said softly. He looked at her, question in his eyes. I think your brother feels responsible for your entire family, she said. I imagine it's a heavy burden. Colin tried to keep his face impassive, but he'd never been an accomplished stoic, and he must have shown his dismay on his face, because Penelope practically rose from her seat as she rushed to add, Not that I think he minds it. It's part of who he is. Exactly, Colin exclaimed, as if he'd just discovered something that was actually important, as opposed to this inane discussion about his life. He had nothing to complain about. He knew he had nothing to complain about, and yet... Did you know Benedict paints? He found himself asking. Of course, she replied. Everyone knows he paints. He has a painting in the National Gallery, and I believe they are planning to hang another soon, another landscape. Really? She nodded. Eloise told me. He slumped again. Then it must be true. I can't believe no one mentioned it to me. You've been away, she reminded him. What I'm trying to say, he continued, is that they both have a purpose to their lives. I have nothing. That can't be true, she said. I should think I would be in a position to know. Penelope sat back, startled by the sharp tone of his voice. I know what people think of me, he began, and although Penelope had told herself that she was going to remain silent, to allow him to speak his mind fully, she couldn't help but interrupt. Everyone likes you, she rushed to say. They adore you. I know, he groaned, looking anguished and sheepish at the same time. But he raised a hand through his hair. Gosh, how to say this without sounding a complete ass? Penelope's eyes widened. I'm sick of being thought an empty-headed charmer, he finally blurted out. Don't be silly, she said, faster than immediately. if that were possible. Penelope, no one thinks you're stupid, she said. How would... Because I've been stuck here in London for more years than anyone should have to, she said sharply. I may not be the most popular woman in town, but after 10 years, I have heard more than my share of gossip and lies and foolish opinions, and I have never, not once, heard someone refer to you as stupid. He stared at her for a moment, a bit startled by her passionate defense. I didn't mean stupid precisely, he said in a soft, and he hoped humble voice. More without substance. Even Lady Whistledown refers to me as a charmer. What's wrong with that? Nothing, he replied testily. If she didn't do it every other day, she only publishes every other day. My point exactly, he shot back. If she thought there was anything to me other than my so-called legendary charm, don't you think she would have said so by now? Penelope was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, does it really matter that Lady Whistledown thinks? He slumped forward, smacking his hands against his knees, then yelping with pain when he belatedly remembered his injury. You're missing the point, he said, wincing as he reapplied pressure to his palm. I couldn't care less about Lady Whistledown, but whether we like it or not, she represents the rest of society. I would imagine that there are quite a few people who would take exception to that statement. He raised one brow. Including yourself? Actually, I think Lady Whistledown is rather astute, she said, folding her hands primly in her lap. The woman called you an overripe melon. Two splotches of red burned in her cheeks. An overripe citrus fruit, she ground out. I assure you there is a very big difference. Colin decided then and there that the female mind was a strange and incomprehensible organ, one which no man should even attempt to understand. There wasn't a woman alive who could go from point A to B without stopping at C, D, X, and 12 along the way. Penelope, he finally said, staring at her in disbelief. The woman insulted you. How can you defend her? She said nothing more than the truth, she replied, crossing her arms over her chest. She's been rather kind, actually, since my mother started allowing me to pick out my own clothing. Colin groaned. Surely we were talking about something else at some point. Tell me we didn't intend to discuss your wardrobe. Penelope's eyes narrowed. I believe we were discussing your dissatisfaction with life as the most popular man in London. Her voice rose on the last four words, and Colin realized he'd been scolded soundly, which he found extraordinarily irritating. I don't know why I thought you'd understand, he bit off, hating the childish tinge in his voice, but completely unable to edit it out. I'm sorry, she said, but it's a little difficult for me to sit here and listen to you complain that your life is nothing. I didn't say that. You most certainly did. I said I have nothing, he corrected, trying not to wince as he realized how stupid that sounded. You have more than anyone I know, she said, jabbing him in the shoulder. But if you don't realize that, then maybe you are correct. Your life is nothing. It's too hard to explain, he said in a petulant manner. If you want a new direction for your life, she said, then for heaven's sake, just pick something out and do it. The world is your oyster, Colin. You're young. wealthy, and you're a man. Penelope's voice turned bitter, resentful. You can do anything you want. He scowled, which didn't surprise her. When people were convinced they had problems, the last thing they wanted to hear was a simple, straightforward solution. It's not that simple, he said. It's exactly that simple. She stared at him for the longest moment, wondering perhaps for the first time in her life just who he was. She'd thought she knew everything about him, but she hadn't known that he kept a journal. She hadn't known that he possessed a temper. She hadn't known that he felt dissatisfied with his life. And she certainly hadn't known that he was petulant and spoiled enough to feel that dissatisfaction when heaven knew he didn't deserve to. What right did he have to feel unhappy with his life? How dare he complain, especially to her? She stood, smoothing out her skirts in an awkward, defensive gesture. Next time you want to complain about the trials and tribulations of universal adoration, try being an on-the-shelf spinster for a day. See how that feels, and then let me know what you want to complain about. And then, while Colin was still sprawled on the sofa, gaping at her as if she were some bizarre creature with 3 heads, 12 fingers, and a tail, she swept out of the room. It was, she thought, as she descended the outer steps to the Bruton Street, quite the most splendid exit of her existence. It was really too bad, then, that the man she'd been leaving was the only one in whose company she'd ever wanted to remain. Colin felt like hell all day. His hand hurt like the devil, despite the brandy he'd sloshed both on his skin and into his mouth. The estate agent who'd handled the lease for the snug little terrace house he'd found in Bloomsbury had informed him that the previous tenant was having difficulties, and Colin wouldn't be able to move in today as planned. Would next week be acceptable? And to top it off, he suspected that he might have done irreparable harm to his friendship with Penelope, which made him feel worst of all, since A, he rather valued his friendship with Penelope, and B, he hadn't realized how much he valued his friendship with Penelope, which made him feel slightly panicked. Penelope was a constant in his life, his sister's friend, the one who was always at the fringes of the party, nearby, but not truly a part of things. But the world seemed to be shifting. He'd only been back in England for a fortnight, but already Penelope had changed. Or maybe he'd changed. Or maybe she hadn't changed, but the way he saw her had changed. She mattered. He didn't know how else to put it. And after 10 years of her just being there, it was rather bizarre for her to matter quite so much. He didn't like that they'd parted ways that afternoon on such awkward terms. He couldn't remember feeling awkward with Penelope ever. No, that wasn't true. There was that time, dear gosh, how many years ago was it? 6, 7? His mother had been pestering him about getting married, which was nothing new, except this time she'd suggested Penelope as a potential bride, which was new, and Colin just hadn't been in the mood to deal with his mother's matchmaking in his usual manner, which was to tease her back. And then she didn't. And then she just hadn't stopped. She talked about Penelope all the day and night, it seemed. until Colin finally fled the country. Nothing drastic, just a short jaunt to Wales. But really, what had his mother been thinking? When he'd returned, his mother had wanted to speak with him, of course, except this time it had been because his sister Daphne was with child again, and she had wanted to make a family announcement. But how was he to have known that? So, he had not been looking forward to the visit, since he was sure it would involve a great deal of completely unveiled hints about marriage. Then he had run into his brothers, and they'd started tormenting him about the very same subject, as only brothers can do, and the next thing he knew, he announced in a very loud voice that he was not going to marry Penelope Featherington. Except somehow, Penelope had been standing right there in the doorway, her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with pain and embarrassment, and probably a dozen other unpleasant emotions that he'd been too ashamed to delve into. It had been one of the most awful moments of his life, one, in fact, that he made an effort not to remember. He didn't think Penelope had ever fancied him, at least not any more than other ladies fancied him, but he'd embarrassed her to single her out for such an announcement. It had been unforgivable. He apologized, of course, and she'd accepted, but he'd never quite forgiven himself. And now he'd gone and insulted her again, not in as direct a manner, of course, but he should have thought a bit longer and harder before complaining about his life. Hell, it had sounded stupid even to him. What did he have to complain about? Nothing. And yet, there was still this nagging emptiness, a longing really for something he couldn't define. He was jealous of his brothers, for goodness sake, for having found their passions, their legacies. The only mark Colin had left on the world was in the pages of Lady Whistledown's society papers. What a joke. But all things were relative, weren't they? And they compared, and compared to Penelope, he had little to complain about, which probably meant that he should have kept his thoughts to himself. He didn't like to think of her as an on-the-shelf spinster, but he supposed that was exactly what she was, and it wasn't a position of much reverence in British society. In fact, it was a situation about which many people would complain bitterly. Penelope had never once presented herself as anything less than a stoic, perhaps not content with her lot, but at least accepting of it. And who knows, maybe Penelope had hopes and dreams of a life beyond the one she shared with her mother and sister in their small home in Mount Street. Maybe she had plans and goals of her own, but kept them to herself, under a veil of dignity and good humor. Maybe there was more to her than there seemed. Maybe, he thought with a sigh, she deserved an apology. He wasn't precisely certain what he needed to apologize for. He wasn't certain there was a precise thing that needed it, but the situation needed something. Oh, hell. Now he was going to have to attend the Smythe-Smith musical this evening. It was a painful, discordant annual event, just when one was sure that all the Smythe-Smith daughters had grown up. Some new cousin rose to take her place, each more tone-deaf than the last. But that was where Penelope was going to be that evening, and that meant that was where Colin wouldn't, or, and that meant that was where Colin would be as well. Colin Bridgerton had quite the bevy of young ladies at his side at the Smith musical Wednesday night, all fawning over his injured hand. This author does not know how the injury was sustained. Indeed, Mr. Bridgerton has been rather annoyingly tight-lipped about it. Speaking of annoyances, the man in question seemed rather irritated by all of the attention. Indeed, this author overheard him tell his brother Anthony that he wished he'd left the unrepeatable word bandage at home. Lady Whistledown's Society Pages, April 16th, 1824. Why did she do this to herself? Year after year the invitation arrived by messenger, and year after year Penelope swore she would never, as God was her witness, ever attend another Smith musical. And yet, year after year, she found herself seated in the Smith music room, desperately trying not to cringe, at least not visibly, as the latest generation of Smith girls butchered poor Mr. Mozart in musical effigy. It was painful, horribly, awfully, hideously painful. Truly, there was no other way to describe it. Even more perplexing was what Penelope always seemed. Even more perplexing was that Penelope always seemed to end up in the front row or close to it, which was beyond excruciating. And not just on the ears. Every few years there would be one Smith girl who seemed aware that she was taking part in what could only be termed a crime against auditory law, while the other girls attacked their violins and pianofortes with oblivious vigor. This odd one outplayed with a pained expression on her face, an expression Penelope knew well. It was the face one put on when one wanted to be anywhere but where one was. You could try to hide it, but it always came out in the corners of the mouth, which were held tight and taut, and the eyes, of course, which floated either above or below everyone's else's line of vision. Heaven knew Penelope's face had been cursed with that same expression many a time. Maybe that was why she never quite managed to stay home on a Smith night. Someone had to smile encouragingly and pretend to enjoy the music. Besides, it wasn't as if she were forced to come and listen more than once per year, anyway. Still, one couldn't help but think that there must be a fortune to be made in discreet earplugs. The quartet of girls were warming up, a jumble of discordant notes, and scales that only promised to worsen once they began to play in earnest. Penelope had taken a seat in the center of the second row, much to her sister Felicity's dismay. "There are two perfectly good seats in the back corner," Felicity hissed in her ear. "It's too late now," Penelope returned, settling down on the light, cushioned chair. "Gosh help me," Felicity groaned. Penelope picked up her program and began leafing through. If we don't sit here, someone else will, she said. Precisely my desire. Penelope leaned in so that only her sister could hear her murmured words. We can be counted on to smile and be polite. Imagine if someone like Cressida Toombley sat here and snickered all the way through. Felicity looked around. I don't think Cressida Toombley would be caught dead here. Penelope chose to ignore the statement. The last thing they need is someone seated right in front who likes to make unkind remarks. Those poor girls would be mortified. They're going to be mortified anyway, Felicity grumbled. No, they won't, Penelope said. At least not that one. That one. Or that one, she said, pointing to the two on violins and the one at the piano. But that one? She motioned discreetly to the girl sitting with a cello between her knees, is already miserable. The least we can do is not to make it worse by allowing someone catty and cruel to sit here. She's only going to be eviscerated later this week by Lady Whistledown, Felicity muttered. Penelope opened her mouth to say more, but at that exact moment she realized that the person who had just occupied the seat on her other side was Eloise. Eloise, Penelope said with obvious delight. I thought you were planning to stay home. Eloise grimaced, her skin taking on a decidedly green pallor. I can't explain it, but I can't seem to stay away. It's rather like a carriage accident. You just can't not look. Or listen, Felicity said, as the case may be. Penelope smiled. She couldn't help it. Did I hear you talking about Lady Whistledown when I arrived? Eloise asked. I told Penelope, Felicity said, leaning rather inelegantly across her sister to speak to Eloise, that they're going to be destroyed by Lady W later this week. I don't know, Eloise said thoughtfully. She doesn't pick on the Smith girls every year. I'm not sure why. I know why, cackled a voice from behind. Eloise, Penelope, and Felicity all twisted in their seats, then lurched backward as Lady Danbury's cane came perilously close to their face. Lady Danbury, Penelope gulped, unable to resist the urge to touch her nose, if only to reassure herself that it was still there. I have that Lady Whistledown figured out, Lady Danbury said. You do? Felicity asked. She's a soft at heart, the old lady continued. You see that one? She poked her cane in the direction of the cellist, nearly piercing Eloise's ear in the process. Right over there? Yes, Eloise said, rubbing her ear, although I don't think I'm going to be able to hear her. Probably a blessing, Lady Danbury said before turning back to the subject at hand. You can thank me later. You were saying something about the cellist? Penelope said swiftly, before Eloise said something entirely inappropriate. Of course I was. Look at her, Lady Danbury said. She's miserable. And well, she should be. She's clearly the only one who has a clue as to how dreadful they are. The other three don't have the musical sense of a gnat. Penelope gave her younger sister a rather smug glance. You mark my words, Lady Danbury said. Lady Whistledown won't have a thing to say about this musical. She won't want to hurt that one's feelings. The rest of them,
Felicity, Penelope, and Eloise all ducked as the cane came swinging by. Bah, she couldn't care less for the rest of them. It's an interesting theory, Penelope said. Lady Danbury sat back contentedly in her chair. Yes, it is, isn't it? Penelope nodded. I think you're right. I usually am. Still twisted in her seat, Penelope turned first to Felicity, then to Eloise, and said, It's the same reason why I keep coming to these infernal musicals year after year. To see Lady Danbury? Eloise asked, blinking with confusion. No, because of girls like her. Penelope pointed at the cellist. Because I know exactly how she feels. Don't be silly, Penelope, Felicity said. You've never played piano in public, and even if you did, you're quite accomplished. Penelope turned to her sister. It's not about the music, Felicity. Then the oddest thing happened to Lady Danbury. Her face changed, completely, utterly, astoundingly changed. Her eyes grew misty, wistful, and her lips, which were usually slightly pinched and sarcastic at the corners, softened. I was that girl too, Miss Featherington, she said, so quietly that both Eloise and Felicity were forced to lean forward. Eloise with an, I beg your pardon, and Felicity with a considerably less polite, what? But Lady Danbury only had eyes for Penelope. It is why I attend year after year, the older lady said, just like you. And for a moment Penelope felt the oddest sense of connection to the older woman, which was mad, because they had nothing in common aside from gender, not age, not status, nothing, and yet it was almost as if the Countess had somehow chosen her, for what purpose Penelope could never guess. But she seemed determined to light a fire under Penelope's well-ordered and often boring life. And Penelope couldn't help but think that it was somehow working. Isn't it nice to discover that we're not exactly what we thought we were? Lady Danbury's words from the other night still echoed in Penelope's head, almost like a litany, almost like a dear. Do you know what I think, Miss Featherington? Lady Danbury asked, her tone deceptively mild. I couldn't possibly begin to guess, Penelope said with great honesty and respect in her voice. I think you could be Lady Whistledown. Felicity and Eloise gasped. Penelope's lips parted with surprise. No one had ever even thought to accuse her of such before. It was unbelievable, unthinkable, and rather flattering, actually. Penelope felt her mouth sliding into a sly smile, and she leaned forward as if getting ready to impart news of great import. Lady Danbury leaned forward. Felicity and Eloise leaned forward. Do you know what I think, Lady Danbury? Penelope asked, in a compellingly soft voice. Well, Lady D said, a wicked gleam in her eye. I would tell you that I am breathless with anticipation, but you've already told me once before that you think that I am Lady Whistledown. Are you? Lady Danbury smiled archly. Maybe I am. Felicity and Eloise gasped again, louder this time. Penelope's stomach lurched. Are you admitting it? Eloise whispered. Of course I am not admitting it, Lady Danbury barked, straightening her spine and thumping her cane against the floor with enough force to momentarily stop the four amateur musicians in their warm-up. Even if it were true, and I'm not saying whether or not it is, would I be fool enough to admit it? Then why did you say, because, you ninny head, I'm trying to make a point. She then proceeded to fall silent until Penelope was forced to ask, which is it? Lady Danbury gave them all an extremely exasperated look. That anyone could be Lady Whistledown, she exclaimed, thumping her cane on the floor with renewed vigor. Anyone at all. Well, except me, Felicity put in. I'm quite certain it's not me. Lady Danbury didn't even honor Felicity with a glance. Let me tell you something, she said. As if we could stop you, Penelope said, so sweetly that it came out like a compliment. And truth be told, it was a compliment. She admired Lady Danbury a great deal. She admired anyone who knew how to speak her mind in public. Lady Danbury chuckled. There's more to you than meets the eye, Penelope Featherington. It's true, Felicity said with a grin. She can be rather cruel, for example. Nobody would believe it. But when we were young, Penelope elbowed her in the ribs. See, Felicity said. What I was going to say, Lady Danbury continued, was that the ton is going about my challenge all wrong. How do you suggest we go about it, then? Eloise asked. Lady Danbury waved her hand dismissively in Eloise's face. I have to explain what people are doing wrong first, she said. They keep looking toward the obvious people. People like your mother, she said, turning to Penelope and Felicity. Mother? They both echoed. Oh, please, Lady Danbury scoffed. A bigger busybody this town has never seen. She's exactly the sort of person everyone respects or suspects. Penelope had no idea what to say to that. Her mother was a notorious gossip, but it was difficult to imagine her as Lady Whistledown. Which is why, Lady Danbury continued, a shrewd look in her eye. It can't be her. Well, that, Penelope said with a touch of sarcasm, and the fact that Felicity and I could tell you for certain that it's not her. Ish, if your mother were Lady Whistledown, she'd have figured out a way to keep it from you. My mother? Felicity said doubtfully. I don't think so. What I am trying to say, Lady Danbury ground out, prior to all of these infernal interruptions, Penelope thought she heard Eloise snort, was that if Lady Whistledown were someone obvious, she'd have been found out by now, don't you think? Silence until it became clear some response was required. Then all three of them nodded with appropriate thoughtfulness and vigor. She must be someone that nobody suspects, Lady Danbury said. She has to be. Penelope found herself nodding again. Lady Danbury did make sense in a strange sort of way. Which is why, the older lady continued triumphantly, I am not a likely candidate. Penelope blinked, not quite following the logic. I beg your pardon? Oh, please, Lady Danbury gave Penelope quite the most disdainful glance. Do you think you're the first person to suspect me? Penelope just shook her head. I still think it's you. That earned her a measure of respect. Lady Danbury nodded approvingly as she said, You're cheekier than you look. Felicity leaned forward and said in a rather conspiratorial voice, It's true. Penelope swatted her sister's hand. Felicity? I think the musical is starting, Eloise said. Heaven help us all, Lady Danbury announced. I don't know why Mr. Bridgerton! Penelope had turned to face the small stage area, but she whipped back around to see Colin making his way along the row to the empty seat beside Lady Danbury, apologizing good-naturedly as he bumped into people's knees. His apologies, of course, were accompanied by one of his lethal smiles, and no fewer than 3 ladies positively melted in their seats as a result. Penelope frowned. It was disgusting. Penelope, Felicity whispered, did you just grow? Colin, Eloise said, I didn't know you were coming. He shrugged, his face alight with a lopsided grin. Changed my mind at the last moment. I've always been a great lover of music, after all. Which would explain your presence here, Eloise said, in an exceptionally dry voice. Colin acknowledged her statement with nothing more than an arch of his brow, before turning to Penelope and saying, Good evening, Miss Featherington. He nodded at Felicity with another, Miss Featherington. It took Penelope a moment to find her voice. They had parted most awkwardly that afternoon, and now here he was with a friendly smile. Good evening, Mr. Bridgerton, she finally managed. Does anyone know what is on the program tonight? He asked, looking terribly interested. Penelope had to admire that. Colin had a way of looking at you as if nothing in the world could be more interesting than your next sentence. It was a talent, that, especially now, when they all knew that he couldn't possibly care one way or another what the Smith girls chose to play that evening. I believe it's Mozart, Felicity said. They almost always choose Mozart. Lovely, Colin replied, leaning back in his chair as if he'd just finished an excellent meal. I am a great fan of Mr. Mozart. In that case, Lady Danbury cackled, elbowing him in the ribs, you might want to make your escape while the possibility still exists. Don't be silly, he said. I'm sure the girls will do their best. Oh, there's no question of them doing their best, Eloise said ominously. Shh, Penelope said. I think they're ready to begin. Not, she admitted to herself that she was especially eager to listen to the Smith version of Ein klein Lakimusk, but she felt profoundly ill at ease with Colin. She wasn't sure what to say to him, except that whether it was she should say definitely shouldn't be said in front of Eloise, Felicity, and most of all Lady Danbury. A butler came around and snuffed out a few candles to signal that the girls were ready to begin. Penelope braced herself, swallowed in such a way as to clog her inner ear canals. It didn't work. And then the torture began, and went on and on and on. Penelope wasn't certain what was more agonizing, the music or the knowledge that Colin was sitting right behind her. The back of her neck prickled with awareness, and she found herself fidgeting like mad, her fingers tapping relentlessly on the dark blue velvet of her skirt. When the Smith quartet was finally done, three of the girls were beaming at the polite applause, and the fourth, the cellist, looked as if she wanted to crawl under a rock. Penelope sighed. At least she, in all of her unsuccessful sessions, hadn't ever been forced to parade her deficiencies before all the ton like those girls had. She'd always been allowed to melt into the shadows, to hover quietly at the perimeter of the room, watching the other girls take their turns on the dance floor. Oh, her mother dragged her there and there, trying to place her in the path of some eligible gentleman or another, but that was nothing, nothing like what the Smith girls were forced to endure. Although, in all honesty, 3 out of the 4 seemed blissfully unaware of their musical ineptitude, Penelope just smiled and clapped. She certainly wasn't going to burst their collective bubble. And if Lady Danbury's theory was correct, Lady Whistledown wasn't going to write a word about the musical. The applause petered out rather quickly, and soon everyone was milling about, making polite conversation with their neighbors and eyeing the sparsely laid refreshment table at the back of the room. Lemonade, Penelope murmured to herself. Perfect. She was dreadfully hot. Really. What had she been thinking? Wearing velvet on such a warm night, and a cool beverage would be just the thing to make her feel better. Not to mention that Colin was trapped in conversation with Lady Danbury, so it was the ideal time to make her escape. But as soon as Penelope had her glass in hand, she heard Colin's achingly familiar voice behind her, murmuring her name. She turned around, and before she had any idea what she was doing, she said, "I'm sorry?" "You are?" "Yes," she assured him. "At least I think I am." His eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. The conversation grows more intriguing by the second. "Colin," he held out his arm, "take a turn with me around the room, will you?" "I don't think—" He moved his arm closer to her, just by an inch or so, but the message was clear. "Please," he said. She nodded and set her lemonade down. Very well. They walked in silence for almost a minute. Then Colin said, "I would like to apologize to you. I was the one who stormed out of your room," Penelope pointed out. He tilted his head slightly, and she could see an indulgent smile playing across his lips. "I'd hardly call it storming," he said. Penelope frowned. She probably shouldn't have left in such a huff, but now that she had, she was oddly proud of it. It wasn't every day that a woman such as herself got to make such a dramatic exit. "Well, I shouldn't have been so rude," she muttered, by now not really meaning it. He arched a brow, then obviously decided not to pursue the matter. "I would like to apologize," he said, "for being such a whiny little brat." Penelope actually tripped over her feet. He helped her regain her balance, then said, "I am aware that I have many, many things in my life for which I should be grateful, for which I am grateful," he corrected. his mouth not quite smiling but certainly sheepish. It was unforgivably rude to complain to you. No, she said. I have spent all evening thinking about what you said, and while I... She swallowed, then licked her lips, which had gone quite dry. She'd spent all day trying to think of the right words, and she'd thought that she'd found them, but now that he was here at her side, she couldn't think of a deuced thing. Do you need another glass of lemonade? Colin asked politely. She shook her head. You have every right to your feelings, she blurted out. They may not be what I would feel were I in your shoes, but you have every right to them. But she broke off, and Colin found himself rather desperate to know what she planned to say. But what, Penelope? He urged. It's nothing. It's not nothing to me. His hand was on her arm, and so he squeezed slightly to let her know that he meant what he said. For the longest time he didn't think she was actually going to respond, and then, just when he thought his face would crack from the smile he held so carefully on his lips, they were in public after all, and it wouldn't do to invite comment and speculation by appearing urgent and disturbed. She sighed. It was a lovely sound, strangely comforting, soft and wise, and it made him want to look at her more closely, to see into her mind, to hear the rhythms of her soul. Colin, Penelope said quietly, if you feel frustrated by your current situation, you should do something to change it. It's really that simple. That's what I do, he said, with a careless shrug of his outside shoulder. My mother accuses me of picking up and leaving the country completely on whim, but the truth is, you do it when you're feeling frustrated, she finished for him. He nodded. She understood him. He wasn't sure how it happened, or even that it made any sense, but Penelope Featherington understood him. I think you should publish your journals, she said. I couldn't. Why not? He stopped in his tracks, letting go of her arm. He didn't really have an answer, other than the odd pounding in his heart. Who'd want to read them? He finally asked. I would, she said frankly. Eloise, Felicity, she added, ticking off names on her fingers. Your mother, Lady Whistledown, I'm sure, she added with a mischievous smile. She does write about you rather a lot. Her good humor was infectious, and Colin couldn't quite suppress his smile. Penelope, it doesn't count if the only people who buy the book are the people I know. Why not? Her lips twitched. You know a lot of people? Why, if you only count Bridgertons. He grabbed her hand. He didn't know why, but he grabbed her hand. Penelope, stop. She just laughed. I think Eloise told me that you have piles and piles of cousins as well, and... Enough, he warned, but he was grinning as he said it. Penelope stared down at her hand in his, then said, Lots of people will want to read about your travels. Maybe at first it will only be because you're a well-known figure in London, but it won't take long before everyone realizes what a good writer you are, and then they'll be clamoring for more. I don't want to be a success because of the Bridgerton name, he said. She dropped his hand and planted hers on her lips, on her hips. Are you even listening to me? I just told you that. What are you two talking about? Eloise looking very, very curious. Nothing, they both murmured at the same time. Eloise snorted. Don't insult me. It's not nothing, Penelope. Looked as if she might start breathing fire at any moment. Your brother is just being obtuse, Penelope said. Well, that is nothing new, Eloise said. Wait a minute, Colin explained. But what? Eloise probed, ignoring him entirely. Is he being obtuse about? It's a private matter, Colin ground out. Which makes it all the more interesting, Eloise said. She looked to Penelope expectantly. I'm sorry, Penelope said. I really can't say. I can't believe it, Eloise cried out. You're not going to tell me? No, Penelope replied, feeling rather oddly satisfied with herself. I'm not. I can't believe it, Eloise said with a grin. Turning to her brother, I can't believe it. His lips quirked into the barest of smiles. Believe it. You are keeping secrets from me. He raised his brows. Did you think I told you everything? Of course not, she scowled. But I thought Penelope did. But this isn't my secret to tell, Penelope said. It's Colin's. I think the planet has shifted on its axis, Eloise grumbled. Or perhaps England has crashed into France. All I know is this is not the same world I inhabited just this morning. Penelope couldn't help it. She giggled. And you're laughing at me, Eloise added. No, I'm not, Penelope said, laughing. Really, I'm not. Do you know what you need? Colin asked. Me? Eloise queried. He nodded. A husband. You're as bad as mother. I could be a lot worse if I really put my mind to it. Of that I have no doubt, Eloise shot back. Stop, stop, Penelope said, truly laughing in earnest now. They both looked at her expectantly, as if to say, now what? I'm so glad I came tonight, Penelope said, the word tumbling unbidden from her lips. I can't remember a nicer evening, truly I can't. Several hours later, as Colin was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling in the bedroom of his new flat in Bloomsbury, it occurred to him that he felt the exact same way.